If love had a deadline, hers was measured in heartbeats, and she was running out of time. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the hospital room, casting a pale glow over Lily Carter as she sat in a stiff plastic chair, her newborn cradled carefully against her chest, his tiny fingers curling weakly around the edge of her sleeve, as if even he understood the urgency pressing down on them both. The steady beep of a nearby monitor slicing through the silence like a ticking clock she couldn't escape, while a doctor stood at the foot of the bed, his expression gentle but firm, explaining something she had already heard twice but still couldn't fully process. "We'll need the father's consent for the next step," he said, his voice calm, practiced, detached in the way only someone used to delivering difficult truths could be, and Lily swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the small face resting against her, her voice barely above a whisper as she answered, "He's not coming." Because 7 months ago, under a sky heavy with rain and broken promises, Ethan Cole had walked away from her without looking back, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk with trembling hands and a truth he refused to believe. And now the weight of that moment pressed into her chest just as heavily as the child she held, her mind slipping back despite herself to that night, the cold biting through her thin coat, the rain soaking her hair as it clung to her face while she stood outside his sleek downtown apartment building, her voice shaking but determined as she told him the words that had changed everything. "I'm pregnant." And for a split second, just a second, there had been something in his eyes, something human, something hopeful even, before it vanished, replaced by doubt so sharp it cut deeper than anything he could have said, his jaw tightening, his voice turning cold, controlled, distant. "That's not possible," he had said, not asking, not wondering, but deciding, as if her truth could be dismissed with a single sentence, as if she were just another problem to solve. And Lily remembered the way her heart had dropped, the way her fingers had instinctively curled protectively over her stomach. "Ethan, I would never lie about this," she had pleaded, her voice breaking. But he had already stepped back, already creating distance, already building walls she couldn't break through. "I don't have time for this," he said, the words sharper now, final. "If you're looking for money, talk to my lawyer." And that was the moment something inside her cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like glass under pressure, because she hadn't asked for money, hadn't asked for anything except the truth to be seen, and yet he had reduced her to something transactional, something disposable, and she remembered shaking her head, tears mixing with rain. "I didn't come here for money," she whispered, but he didn't respond, didn't soften, didn't stay. He just turned and walked back into the building, leaving her standing there as the door closed behind him with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any slam. And now, months later, that same silence followed her into this hospital room, wrapping around her like a shadow as she looked down at her son, brushing a gentle thumb across his cheek, her voice steadier now, but laced with something stronger than pain, something unbreakable. "It's okay," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "We don't need him." Even though the world seemed determined to remind her otherwise, even though every form, every question, every requirement pointed back to the one person who had already made his choice, and outside the hospital window, the city moved on as if nothing had changed, as if somewhere just a few miles away, Ethan Cole wasn't standing at the top of a glass tower, completely unaware that the life he had walked away from was still breathing, still fighting, still waiting, not for his money, not for his name, but for the truth he had refused to see. The hallway outside the hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee, a quiet reminder that life here moved on schedules and systems that did not care about broken stories. And Lily Carter quickly learned that survival was not a single moment, but a series of small decisions made every hour as she adjusted the thin blanket around her son and listened to the nurse explain discharge instructions she could barely afford to follow, the numbers alone pressing against her chest heavier than fear ever could, because the reality was simple and unforgiving. She had no savings, no family nearby, and no one to sign the papers the hospital kept sliding gently toward her, each one a reminder of the man who had chosen absence over truth. And yet she nodded, thanked them, and stood on her own 2 feet anyway, because there was no alternative, Because there was a life in her arms that depended on her staying upright no matter how much the world leaned against her. And by the time she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the city felt louder than she remembered. Cars passing, people rushing, everyone moving forward with purpose while she stood still for just a second. On the sidewalk, shifting the weight of her baby carrier and tightening her grip as if letting go even slightly might cause everything to fall apart. "We are okay," she whispered under her breath, the words quiet but deliberate. And then she started walking, not toward anything certain, but away from everything that had already been lost, finding her way to a small apartment on the edge of town that Mrs. Harper had helped her secure. A narrow space above an old convenience store where the floors creaked and the windows let in more wind than light, but it was warm enough and it was hers, and that alone was enough to begin again. The days that followed blending into a rhythm defined by exhaustion and determination as Lily worked early morning shifts at a local diner, tying her hair back quickly while rocking the baby carrier gently with her foot, memorizing orders, pouring coffee, smiling when she could and holding herself together when she could not. Every dollar counted, every hour mattered, and still it never felt like enough. But she kept going, because stopping was not an option, because giving up was not something she allowed herself to consider. And at night, when the city finally quieted, she would sit by the small window with her son asleep against her chest, her fingers tracing the edge of a folded piece of paper she had kept hidden in the bottom drawer, the ultrasound image from months ago, slightly worn now from being held too many times, too tightly, a silent reminder of a moment that had once held hope before it was replaced by doubt. And beside it, tucked carefully beneath, a ring she had never been given, something Ethan had once mentioned in passing, something that had never become real. And sometimes she would look at both and feel the ache rise again, not for the life she had lost, but for the truth that had never been seen. And still, even then, she would close the drawer, lift her chin slightly, and whisper the same promise into the quiet room. "We will be enough." Not as a question, not as a wish, but as a decision she intended to keep no matter how long it took. Across the city, high above the noise and motion that defined everyone else's survival, Ethan Cole stood in silence behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the skyline stretching endlessly before him like a promise he had already fulfilled and yet somehow failed to feel, his reflection faint against the glass as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished floor. And to anyone looking in from the outside, his life appeared flawless, a carefully constructed image of success, control, and certainty. But inside, something did not sit right, something small but persistent that refused to settle no matter how many deals were closed or how many numbers aligned in his favor. And it had been there for months now, quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, but growing stronger in the spaces between meetings. In the moments when the room emptied and he was left alone with nothing but his thoughts. And today, for reasons he could not fully explain, it felt louder than ever. "You have the final numbers for the merger," his assistant Claire said as she stepped into the office, her tone efficient, focused, exactly what he expected, and Ethan nodded without turning. "Send them to legal," he replied, his voice steady, controlled, but distant in a way even he noticed. And Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking again. "You have a dinner tonight with the board and Miss Davenport." And at that name, something shifted slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that he exhaled slower than usual. "Reschedule," he said, and this time Claire did pause, fully, because Ethan Cole did not reschedule important dinners. He did not deviate. He did not hesitate. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully, and he turned then, finally facing her, his expression composed, but his eyes carrying something harder to define. "I just need a quiet night," he answered, and it was the closest thing to honesty he had offered in weeks, because the truth was, quiet had become the only place where the past found him, not loudly, not dramatically, but in fragments, in flashes that came without warning, a memory of rain against glass, a voice that had once stood in front of him asking to be believed, a look he had dismissed too quickly, and he pushed it away every time, convincing himself that he had made the logical decision, that he had protected himself from something uncertain, something inconvenient, something that did not fit into the structure of the life he had built. But logic had never quite silenced the feeling that something had been left unresolved. And as Claire left the room, closing the door softly behind her, Ethan reached for the tablet on his desk, scrolling through reports until his attention caught on a small internal memo flagged by legal, a routine review request involving a former consultant. Nothing significant at first glance, but attached to it was a name he had not seen in months. A name that caused his hand to still for just a second longer than it should have. Lily Carter. And the moment stretched, quiet and heavy, as if the world outside the glass had slowed to a stop, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he opened the file, not knowing that this small, almost insignificant decision would be the first crack in the certainty he had relied on, the first step toward a truth he had once refused to see. And as the screen illuminated his face, reflecting back at him not just the man he was but the choice he had made, something deeper than doubt began to rise, something closer to realization, though not fully formed, not yet understood, but impossible to ignore. The name on the screen did not just sit there, it lingered, as if it carried weight beyond letters and data, and Ethan Cole found himself staring at it longer than logic could justify, his finger hovering just above the tablet, as if opening the file required more than a simple touch, as if it meant stepping back into something he had deliberately closed off months ago, and yet he pressed it anyway. The document expanding into view with clinical precision, dates, timestamps, internal notes, a timeline of transactions and correspondence that should have meant nothing more than routine verification, but buried within the attachments was something that shifted the air in the room entirely. A forwarded email chain marked confidential, and as he scrolled, his expression began to tighten, not dramatically, but subtly, the way control starts to slip before it fully breaks, because the messages did not match what he remembered, they did not align with the version of events he had accepted without question, and then he saw it. A manipulated report, a falsified statement that had been sent to him months ago, the very piece of information that had planted doubt in his mind, the same doubt that had led him to walk away without asking, without verifying, without giving her the chance to be heard. And now, line by line, the truth began to rearrange itself in front of him, quiet but undeniable, and his chest tightened in a way he could not immediately name. "This is not possible," he said under his breath, though there was no one there to hear it, because the evidence was clear, time-stamped. Corrections, internal flags, a note from compliance that had been overlooked or perhaps buried too quickly, and attached to it all was a name he recognized instantly. Victor Lang, a senior advisor who had once stood beside him in meetings, offering guidance, shaping decisions, trusted without hesitation, and now, suddenly, that trust felt misplaced, because the documents suggested intent, not error, a deliberate misrepresentation designed to lead Ethan to a specific conclusion, and that conclusion had been Lily, had been her truth dismissed as deception, her voice reduced to something convenient to ignore, and for the first time, Ethan did not feel certainty. He felt something far less stable, something closer to doubt turning inward, because if the foundation of that decision was false, then everything built on top of it began to shift, and he leaned back slowly, the city behind him fading into irrelevance as his focus narrowed entirely on the screen, on the realization. Forming piece by piece, "Claire," he called out, his voice sharper now, more urgent than before, and within seconds she stepped back into the office, her posture straight, attentive. "I need everything you have on Victor Lang," he said, his tone leaving no room for delay, and she nodded immediately, sensing the change without needing explanation. "Right away," she replied before moving quickly to carry out the request, and Ethan remained where he was, his hand resting against the edge of the desk as the weight of what he was seeing settled deeper, because this was no longer about a business error, no longer about a minor discrepancy. This was about a choice he had made based on something untrue, a moment where he had chosen distance instead of trust. And as the memory of that night returned again, clearer this time, sharper, he could no longer hold on to the version of himself that had felt justified walking away. Because now there was a question that refused to be ignored, one that echoed louder with every passing second. What if she had been telling the truth all along? And for the first time since that night, Ethan did not push the thought away. He let it stay. He let it grow, because something inside him understood that this was not the end of a mistake. It was the beginning of realizing just how much it had cost. The moment Claire returned with the preliminary report, the atmosphere in the office had already shifted from controlled precision to something far more urgent, and Ethan Cole did not wait for her to speak before taking the file from her hands, his eyes scanning the first page with a focus that bordered on relentless, every line pulling him further away from the certainty he had once relied on. Because what had started as a small inconsistency was now unfolding into something far more deliberate, a pattern of altered communications, rerouted approvals, and selectively presented information that all pointed back to the same conclusion, that the narrative he had believed about Lily Carter had been constructed, not discovered. And as he flipped to the final page, his jaw tightened, the evidence no longer leaving room for doubt. He controlled the entire chain, Claire said carefully, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. Every report that reached you went through Victor first, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too clearly, because this was not just a professional failure, it was a personal one, a moment where he had chosen convenience over truth, assumption over trust, and the weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest. Get legal involved, he said finally, his tone low but firm. I want a full internal review and I want it now. And Claire nodded, already turning to carry out the order, but before she reached the door, his voice stopped her again, sharper this time. And find out everything you can about Lily Carter. And that was the first time he had said her name out loud in months, the first time he had allowed it to exist in the same space as him without immediately pushing it away. And Claire paused, just briefly, before nodding again, understanding that this request carried more weight than any business directive he had given that day. And when the door closed behind her, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with something far more difficult to ignore, memory, not fragmented this time, but complete, the way Lily had stood in front of him, not defensive, not manipulative, but certain, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, asking him to believe her. And he had not just doubted her, he had dismissed her entirely, reduced her truth to something transactional, something easy to walk away from. And now, sitting alone in the office that had always represented control, Ethan felt something he had not felt in a long time. Regret, not the distant kind that fades with time, but the immediate kind that presses in, that demands acknowledgement, that refuses to be rationalized away. And he stood abruptly, moving toward the window as if the view might steady him. But the city below offered no answers, only movement, only distance, and for the first time, he understood that distance had been his choice, not hers, that every mile between them had been created by a decision he could no longer justify. And as the realization settled, one thought rose above the rest, clear and unavoidable. If she had been telling the truth, then there was more than just an apology waiting for him on the other side of that mistake. There was something far greater, something he had walked away from without even realizing it. And that understanding did not bring clarity, it brought urgency, because whatever remained unresolved was no longer in the past. It was still out there, still living, still moving forward without him. And for the first time, Ethan Cole was no longer standing still. The city looked different when urgency replaced routine, and for Ethan Cole, every minute that passed now felt like something slipping further out of reach as he stepped into the back seat of his car, the door closing with a muted thud that barely registered against the noise building inside his mind. Find her, he said simply, his voice steady but carrying a weight that left no room for delay, and the driver nodded, pulling into traffic as the skyline began to shift around them, buildings giving way to streets he rarely noticed, neighborhoods that existed outside the polished world he had built. And in the front seat, Claire was already working, her tablet glowing with search results, records, fragments of a life that had continued without him. We found a previous address, she said, her tone focused. It is not current, but it is a starting point. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting against his knees, not impatient, but intent, because this was no longer about convenience. This was about time, about distance, about a reality that had been unfolding while he remained unaware. And when the car finally slowed to a stop outside a narrow street lined with aging buildings and flickering signs, the contrast was immediate, stark, and impossible to ignore, because this was not a place he belonged, not a place he had ever needed to consider. And yet this was where her life had been, where it had continued after he walked away, and he stepped out without hesitation. The cool air hitting him sharply as he looked up at the building in front of him, worn brick. Dim stairwell. A single light flickering above the entrance as if unsure whether to stay on or give out entirely. And for a moment, he just stood there, not because he was unsure where to go, but because he was beginning to understand how far removed he had been from her reality, how easily he had dismissed something he had never taken the time to see. "Third floor," Claire said quietly, stepping beside him. And he nodded once before moving forward, the stairs creaking under each step as he climbed, the sound echoing in the narrow space, each level bringing him closer to something he could no longer ignore. And when he reached the door, his hand paused just before knocking, not out of hesitation, but because this moment carried something irreversible, something that could not be undone once it began. And then he knocked, once, firm but controlled, the sound cutting through the silence inside, and for a few seconds, nothing happened, no movement, no response. Just the faint hum of the building around him, until finally, the door opened slightly, revealing not Lily, but an older woman with kind but cautious eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, and Ethan straightened slightly, his voice measured but direct. "I am looking for Lily Carter." And the woman studied him for a moment, as if weighing something unspoken, before her expression shifted, not with recognition, but with understanding. "You are late," she said quietly, and the words landed heavier than anything else could have, not accusatory, not angry, just true, and Ethan felt them settle in a place he could not deflect. "She does not live here anymore," the woman continued, opening the door a bit wider. "She moved out months ago." And for a brief moment, the urgency inside him sharpened into something closer to fear, not of losing control, but of being too late to fix what he had broken. "Do you know where she went?" he asked. And the woman hesitated, then nodded slightly. "She has a baby now," she said, her voice softer, as if the words themselves carried significance. "She needed somewhere closer to the hospital." And everything seemed to narrow at once. The noise, the space, the distance, all collapsing into a single realization that echoed louder than anything else. A baby, and Ethan's breath slowed, not from confusion, but from understanding finally taking shape. Because this was no longer a possibility, no longer a question. It was real, it was present, it was his, and for the first time since he had opened that file, the truth was no longer on a screen. It was alive somewhere in this city, and he was already behind. The word baby did not echo. It settled, heavy and undeniable, as Ethan Cole stepped back from the doorway, the narrow hallway suddenly feeling too small to contain the realization forming inside him. And for a moment he did not move, did not speak, because everything he had believed, everything he had justified, had just shifted into something far more personal, far more irreversible. "Which hospital?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, more controlled but carrying a weight that had not been there before. And the woman studied him again, longer this time, as if deciding whether he was someone worth trusting with that answer, before she gave a small nod. "Westbridge Community Hospital," she said, and that name alone was enough to send a sharp clarity through him, because it was not one of the private facilities he was accustomed to, not one designed for comfort or discretion, but one built for necessity, for those who had no other options. And without another word, he turned, already moving down the stairs faster than before, each step louder, heavier, driven not by impatience, but by something far more urgent, something that no longer allowed distance to exist between intention and action. And by the time he reached the street, Claire was already on her phone, coordinating directions, her voice precise but quick, matching the pace he had set without needing instruction. "We can be there in 15 minutes, she said as the car door opened. And Ethan did not respond. He simply got in, his gaze fixed ahead as the city blurred past, buildings and traffic fading into the background as his thoughts narrowed into a single, undeniable truth. There was a child, his child, somewhere in that hospital, and for 7 months, that life had existed without him, without his knowledge, without his presence, because he had chosen not to believe, and that choice now carried consequences he could not undo, only face. And when the car finally pulled up to the hospital entrance, the contrast was immediate. The building smaller, less polished, the lights harsher, the atmosphere defined not by luxury but by necessity. And he stepped out without hesitation, moving through the sliding doors as the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, the sound of distant monitors and quiet conversations surrounding him. And for a brief second, he paused, not because he did not know where to go, but because this was no longer a place he could control, no longer a situation he could navigate with certainty. This was real, immediate, and entirely outside the structure he had built his life around. "I will check the records desk," Claire said, already moving ahead, and Ethan followed, his steps slower now, more deliberate, as if each one carried weight, as if each one brought him closer to something he was not sure he was ready to face. And when Claire returned, her expression had shifted, not alarmed, not urgent, but serious in a way that required attention. "She is here," she said quietly, and for a moment, everything seemed to still, the noise, the movement, the space around him narrowing into that single statement. "Room 214, she added, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not to steady himself, but to acknowledge what could no longer be avoided, because this was it, the point where realization met reality, where the past he had walked away from stood directly in front of him. Again, not as memory, not as regret, but as something living, breathing, waiting, and without another word, he turned toward the hallway, his steps measured now, controlled, but carrying something far deeper than confidence, something closer to accountability, because whatever waited behind that door was not just a conversation, it was the truth he had refused to see, and this time, he was not walking away. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. Each step toward room 214 measured not by distance, but by the weight pressing against Ethan Cole's chest, the soft hum of hospital lights above him blending with the distant beeping of monitors and quiet conversations that seemed to exist in a world separate from his own. And for the first time in years, he was not walking into a room with answers. He was walking into one with consequences. And when he finally reached the door, his hand lifted, but did not immediately knock, not out of hesitation, but because he understood that everything on the other side of that door existed without his permission, without his control. And then he knocked, once, firm but controlled, the sound echoing softly before the door opened just a few inches. And there she was, Lily Carter, standing on the other side, her hair loosely tied back, her face thinner than he remembered but stronger in a way he had never fully seen before, her eyes meeting his with a calm that was not welcoming, not surprised, just aware. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence holding everything that had never been said, until she stepped back slightly, opening the door wider without a word, and Ethan stepped inside. The room small, simple, filled with the quiet presence of something far more significant than either of them, because near the window, in a small hospital bassinet, lay the reality he had only just begun to understand, and his gaze moved there instinctively, drawn not by curiosity, but by something deeper, something unspoken that pulled him closer as he took a step forward, then another, until he stood beside it, looking down, and the world seemed to narrow into that single moment, because the child was real, impossibly small, wrapped in a light blanket, breathing softly, completely unaware of the storm that had existed before him, and Ethan's breath slowed, not from confusion, but from recognition, because there was no doubt, no question left to consider. The truth was right there, undeniable and immediate, and behind him, Lily's voice broke the silence, steady but distant. "You found us," she said, not as a question, but as a statement that carried no expectation, and Ethan turned slightly, his expression no longer controlled in the way it had always been, but something else now, something closer to honesty. "I should have come sooner," he said, the words quiet but heavy, and Lily held his gaze for a moment before looking away, not dismissing him, but not accepting the apology either, because time had already done its work, because absence had already shaped something that could not be undone with a single sentence. And Ethan looked back down at the child again, his hand hovering slightly above the edge of the bassinet, not touching, not yet, as if unsure whether he had the right. And for the first time, The distance he had created felt real, not measured in miles or months, but in moments missed, in choices made, and in the quiet space between what should have been and what was now standing in front of him. And as the baby shifted slightly, his tiny hand moving instinctively, brushing against Ethan's finger for just a brief second, something inside him tightened, not sharply, but deeply, a realization that did not need words, because this was not about proof anymore. It was about presence, and he had been absent, and that truth settled heavier than anything else, because for the first time since that night, he was no longer questioning what had happened. He was facing it, fully, completely, and without the distance that had once made it easy to ignore. The silence in the room did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something fragile being tested under pressure, and Ethan Cole remained standing beside the bassinet, his gaze still fixed on the small life in front of him, as if looking away would somehow make it less real. But it did not. It only made the weight of it settle deeper, and behind him, Lily Carter moved slightly, adjusting the blanket with practiced care, her hands steady in a way that spoke of months spent doing this alone, without hesitation, without anyone to lean on. And that contrast did not escape him, because everything about her presence in that moment carried a quiet strength that had never needed his approval to exist. "He was early," she said after a moment, her voice calm, not inviting conversation but not avoiding it either, and Ethan turned slightly, his attention shifting back to her. "Is he okay?" he asked, the question simple but genuine, and Lily nodded once, her eyes briefly meeting his before moving back to the child. "He is strong," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that made the word feel earned, not assumed, as if strength had been required long before that moment, as if it had been the only option available. And Ethan let out a slow breath, absorbing that without trying to respond immediately, because this was not a conversation he could control or direct. This was something he had to step into carefully, honestly, and without expectation. "I know what happened," he said finally, his voice lower now, carrying none of the authority he was used to, just the weight of realization. And Lily's hands paused for a brief second, not because she was surprised, but because she had already lived through the consequences of that truth. "Do you?" she asked quietly, not challenging him, not doubting him, but simply acknowledging that knowing now did not erase what had already been done. And Ethan nodded, stepping back slightly from the bassinet, giving the space the respect it deserved. "I was given false information," he continued, choosing each word carefully, not to defend himself, but to explain what should have been questioned from the beginning. "I should have come to you. I should have listened." And this time Lily looked at him fully, her expression unchanged, steady, grounded in something that did not shift easily anymore. "But you did not," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it was not about blame. It was about fact, and Ethan accepted that, not with resistance, but with a quiet acknowledgement that settled into his posture, into the way he held himself now, less certain, more present. "No, I did not," he replied, and for a moment, that was all there was, no argument, no justification, just truth placed plainly between them. And the baby stirred again, a soft sound breaking through the stillness, and Lily instinctively moved closer, lifting him gently, holding him against her shoulder with a familiarity that spoke of countless nights, countless moments Ethan had not been there to witness. And he watched, not as an outsider anymore, but not yet as something else either, suspended in the space between what he had been and what he might still have a chance to become. And as Lily settled back into the chair, the child resting quietly against her, she did not look at Ethan again when she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "He does not need promises," she said, her hand moving gently along the baby's back. "He needs consistency." And the words landed exactly where they needed to, not as rejection, not as acceptance, but as a boundary drawn from experience. And Ethan did not respond right away, because for the first time, he understood that this was not about earning forgiveness in a moment. This was about proving something over time, something that could not be rushed, could not be bought, could not be explained away. And as he stood there, looking at the life he had nearly missed entirely, he realized that whatever came next would not be decided by what he said, but by what he chose to do from this point forward. The words lingered in the air long after Lily spoke them, not loud, not forceful, but steady in a way that made them impossible to ignore. And Ethan Cole did not try to respond immediately, because he understood that anything said too quickly would sound like an attempt to fix something that could not be repaired in a single moment. So instead he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he had only just begun to understand. And for a brief moment, the room settled into a quiet rhythm. The soft sound of the baby's breathing, the distant hum of hospital equipment, and the unspoken tension that still existed between two people whose lives had once been connected in a way neither of them could deny. And then Ethan took a small step back, not leaving, but creating space, the kind of space that respected what Lily had built on her own. "What is his name?" he asked, his voice calm, careful, and Lily hesitated just slightly before answering, not out of uncertainty, but because names carried meaning, carried decisions. "Noah," she said, her hand resting gently against the baby's back, and Ethan repeated it quietly, almost to himself. "Noah," as if saying it made everything more real, more immediate, and he let that settle, the name anchoring him in a way nothing else had since he walked into the room. "It suits him," he added after a moment, not as a compliment, but as an observation that felt sincere, and Lily did not respond, but she did not dismiss it either, and that silence, though small, was different from before, less guarded, but still firm in its boundaries, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving between Lily and the child as if trying to understand where he fit into a picture that had already been drawn without him. "I want to help," he said finally, the words simple, direct, but carrying intention rather than assumption, and Lily looked at him then, not sharply, not defensively, but with a quiet clarity that had been shaped by months of doing exactly what he was now offering. "Help is not something you say," she replied, her tone even, controlled. "It is something you show." And again, the words did not push him away, but they did not pull him in either. They simply set the terms, and Ethan nodded once more, because this time he understood that this was not about convincing her. This was about earning a place he had already lost, and before he could say anything else, there was a soft knock at the door, a nurse stepping in with a clipboard, her smile polite but focused. "We need to go over discharge plans," she said, glancing between them briefly before returning her attention to Lily, and Ethan stepped aside immediately, giving them space, not because he was told to, but because it was the right thing to do, and he watched quietly as Lily listened, asked questions, signed forms. Her movements efficient, practiced, the result of navigating this world without relying on anyone else. And something about that stayed with him, not as guilt this time, but as recognition, because this was what consistency looked like. This was what showing up meant. And when the nurse left, the room fell quiet again, and Ethan did not try to fill it with promises. He simply looked at Lily, then at Noah, and spoke in a tone that carried no urgency, no demand, just intention. "I will be here tomorrow," he said, not asking for permission, not expecting a response, just stating something he intended to follow through on. And for the first time since he had arrived, Lily did not look away immediately. She held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring something unseen, and then she nodded once, not acceptance, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. And in that small, quiet moment, something shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that the future would not be decided by what had already happened, but by what he chose to do next. The next morning arrived without announcement, the early light filtering softly through the hospital window as the city outside began its steady rhythm once again. And inside room 214, Lily Carter moved quietly, adjusting Noah's blanket with the same careful precision she had developed over months of doing everything on her own, her motions calm, practiced, grounded in a routine that did not depend on anyone else showing up. And yet despite that, there was a small part of her that noticed the time, that registered the quiet expectation she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge. And when there was a gentle knock at the door just after 9 o'clock, she did not look surprised. She simply looked up, her expression neutral, composed, as the door opened and Ethan Cole stepped inside, dressed differently than the day before, not in the sharp formality of a boardroom, but in something simpler, less defined by status and more by intention, and in his hands was a small paper bag and 2 cups of coffee, nothing extravagant, nothing excessive, just something thoughtful, something human, and he paused just inside the doorway, not stepping further until her eyes met his. As if waiting for permission, he did not assume he had. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice steady but softer than before, and Lily gave a small nod in return. "Morning," she replied, her tone even, neither inviting nor rejecting, simply acknowledging his presence, and Ethan stepped forward then, placing the coffee gently on the small table near her bed, along with the bag. "I was not sure what you like," he said, not as an excuse, but as an honest admission, and Lily glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to Noah. "It is fine," she said, and that was all, but it was enough. Because this was not about grand gestures, this was about consistency, about showing up in small, deliberate ways that did not demand recognition, and Ethan moved closer to the bassinet, his steps slower this time, more certain, as if the unfamiliar space had begun to settle into something he could navigate without hesitation, and he looked down at Noah again, taking in the small details he had missed before, the way his chest rose and fell, the faint movement of his fingers, the quiet presence that carried more meaning than anything else in the room. And after a moment, he spoke, not to Lily, but softly, almost instinctively. "Hey there." And the words were simple, but they carried something new, something unguarded, and Lily noticed that, not in what he said, but in how he said it, the absence of control, the presence of something real, and she watched him for a second longer than she had the day before, not with trust, not yet, but with a quiet awareness that something had shifted. And Ethan remained there, not reaching out immediately, not assuming anything, just being present in a way he had not been before, and after a moment, he glanced back at Lily, his expression steady. "I spoke to the hospital administration this morning," he said, his tone careful. "Everything for Noah's care is covered." And Lily's hand paused slightly, her eyes lifting to meet his, not angry, not grateful, but firm. "I did not ask for that," she said, and Ethan nodded once, already expecting the response. "I know," he replied. "This is not about what you asked for." And he stopped there, not pushing further, not explaining more than necessary, because he understood now that this was not something he could resolve with solutions alone, and Lily held his gaze for a moment before looking away again, her voice quieter this time, but no less steady. "Then do not make it about money," she said, and Ethan accepted that without hesitation, without defense, because this was not about proving capability, it was about proving presence. And as the morning light grew stronger in the room, filling the space with a quiet warmth, something else began to take shape, not forgiveness, not trust, but the beginning of something that had not existed the day before, a pattern, a rhythm, the first sign that showing up once could be coincidence, but showing up again might mean something more. The third day did not arrive with announcement or expectation. It arrived quietly, the same way everything meaningful had begun to unfold. And this time Ethan Cole was already there before the morning light had fully settled into the room. Sitting in the chair near the window with a paper cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, his posture relaxed but alert, as if presence had replaced urgency. And when Lily Carter opened her eyes, she noticed him immediately, not because he moved or spoke, but because he had already been there long enough to become part of the space. And for a brief second, she said nothing, simply taking in the quiet consistency of it, the absence of interruption, the absence of demand, just someone who had chosen to stay without needing acknowledgement. And she shifted slightly, adjusting Noah in her arms as he stirred softly, and Ethan stood then, not abruptly, not intrusively, but naturally, as if responding to a rhythm he was beginning to understand. "He was up, eh?" "Few minutes ago," he said, his voice low, careful not to disturb the calm in the room. And Lily nodded once, her movements still focused, still grounded in the routine she had built. But there was something different now, not trust, not comfort, but awareness, the recognition that his presence was no longer unfamiliar. And Ethan stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance, his gaze moving to Noah as he shifted again. And after a moment, he spoke, not asking for permission, but not assuming it either. "Can I?" He paused briefly, choosing the words carefully. "Can I hold him?" And the question itself carried more meaning than the action, because it acknowledged something he had not before, that this was not something he was entitled to. And Lily looked at him then, fully, her expression unreadable at first, as if weighing not just the request, but everything behind it. The days he had shown up, the absence of excuses, the quiet consistency that had begun to form a pattern, and after a moment, she nodded once, slowly, and carefully transferred Noah into his arms, her movements precise, steady, and Ethan received him with equal care, his hands adjusting instinctively, his posture shifting as if something within him aligned with the responsibility he was holding. And for a second, everything else faded, the hospital, the past, the distance, all of it replaced by the simple reality of a father holding his child for the first time, and his expression softened, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be controlled, his eyes tracing the small details, the quiet rise and fall of Noah's breathing, the warmth of him, the weight that was both light and immeasurable at the same time. And he did not speak right away, because there was nothing to say that would not feel smaller than the moment itself, and Lily watched him, not with expectation, not with forgiveness, but with a quiet recognition that something real was happening, something that could not be explained away or undone. And after a few seconds, Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I missed this." And it was not a question, not a statement meant to gain sympathy. It was simply truth, placed into the space between them without defense. And Lily did not respond immediately, but her gaze softened slightly, just enough to acknowledge that she heard it, that she understood what it meant without needing to validate it. And the room settled into a stillness that felt different from before, not heavy, not tense, but steady, as if something fragile had begun to take shape, something that required time, patience, and consistency to hold. And as Ethan stood there, holding Noah with a care that had not existed days before, he understood that redemption was not a moment. It was a process, one that had already begun, not through words, but through the simple act of showing up, again and again, without expecting anything in return. The days that followed did not announce themselves as turning points. They unfolded quietly, one after another, each marked not by dramatic change, but by something far more difficult to fake, consistency. And Ethan Cole showed up every morning, not earlier than necessary, not later than expected, but exactly when he said he would, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing at all, but always with the same steady presence that no longer felt out of place in the small hospital room. And Lily Carter noticed, not because she was looking for it, but because it became impossible not to, the way he adjusted his schedule without mentioning it, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he learned Noah's patterns, the slight shifts in breathing, the quiet sounds that meant hunger or restlessness. And he did not ask to be told. He observed, he adapted, he stayed, and over time, the space between them changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, like something rebuilding itself piece by piece without forcing its way forward. And one afternoon, as the sunlight stretched across the floor and the discharge papers were finally signed, marking the moment they would leave the hospital behind, Lily stood near the window, holding Noah close as she looked out at the city that had tested her in ways she had never expected. And Ethan stood a few feet away, not intruding, not distant, just present. And after a moment, she turned to him, her expression calm but clear. "We are going home today," she said, and he nodded once, already aware, already prepared, but not assuming anything beyond what had been given. And there was a pause, brief but meaningful, before she continued, her voice steady, grounded in everything she had lived through. "This does not change everything," she said, and Ethan met her gaze, not with resistance, not with expectation, but with understanding. "I know," he replied, and she held his eyes for a second longer, as if confirming that he truly did, before adding, "But it can change something." And that was not forgiveness, not yet. It was possibility, carefully placed, intentionally limited, but real. And Ethan nodded again, slower this time, because he understood the weight of that offer, the responsibility it carried, and he did not try to expand it, did not try to turn it into more than it was. He simply accepted it for what it meant. And as they prepared to leave, gathering the few belongings Lily had brought with her, the room that had once held tension now felt different, not resolved, but steady. And when they stepped out into the hallway together, the same one that had once felt long and uncertain. It no longer carried the same weight, because this time, they were not walking toward confrontation. They were walking towards something that had yet to be defined, and outside, the air was cool, the city alive in its usual rhythm, but for the first time, Ethan did not see it as something separate from what mattered, because what mattered was right beside him, in Lily's arms, in the quiet strength she carried, in the life that had continued without him but had not closed the door completely. And as they reached the car, he paused for a brief moment, looking at both of them, not with doubt, not with regret alone, but with something more grounded, something steady. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, certain in a way that did not demand belief. "I am not going anywhere," he said, not as a promise meant to convince, but as a commitment he intended to prove. And Lily did not respond right away, but she did not turn away either. She simply adjusted her hold on Noah and stepped forward, and that was enough, because this was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of something that would be built not on words, but on actions repeated day after day, until trust was no longer something fragile, but something real. In this emotional, cinematic journey of love, regret, and redemption, a powerful millionaire and a resilient young mother are brought back together by a truth that was once denied and a child that changes everything. This story explores how one life-altering mistake leads to months of silent suffering, where the young mother is forced to navigate pregnancy, hardship, and survival alone while the millionaire lives unaware of the reality he walked away from. As hidden truths begin to surface, the millionaire uncovers a shocking betrayal that reveals he was manipulated into rejecting the one person who needed him most, setting off a deeply human journey of guilt, accountability, and the desperate need to make things right. Through quiet hospital rooms, fragile first encounters, and moments of unspoken emotion, this story unfolds with the raw intensity that defines the best millionaire stories, showing that love is not proven through wealth, but through presence and consistency. As the millionaire steps into a life he almost lost, he must confront not only the consequences of his absence, but also the strength of a woman who learned to stand without him, creating a powerful dynamic that drives the heart of this narrative. This is more than a love story. It is a reflection of how trust can be broken in seconds and rebuilt only through time and action, making it one of the most compelling millionaire stories that highlights emotional growth, forgiveness, and the meaning of responsibility. With every scene layered in realism and emotional depth, viewers are taken through a transformation that challenges pride, exposes vulnerability, and redefines what it means to truly show up for someone. This unforgettable journey stands out among millionaire stories by focusing not on luxury, but on human connection, where the real wealth lies in second chances and the courage to face the truth. As the story reaches its resolution, the bond between the millionaire and the young mother evolves into something fragile yet hopeful, reminding us that even after loss and misunderstanding, love can still find its way back when it is built on honesty and action. For anyone who seeks heartfelt storytelling with powerful emotional arcs, this is one of those rare millionaire stories that stays with you long after it ends, delivering a message that true redemption is not given, it is earned. Character 1. A white male billionaire CEO, 35 years old, sharp tailored dark suit, clean haircut, confident yet remorseful expression, front view portrait, realistic lighting, high detail skin texture, cinematic realism, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, natural human proportions, modern American setting. Character 2. A white young mother, 26 years old, soft natural makeup, tired but strong eyes, simple casual clothes, gentle facial features, front view portrait, realistic lighting, high detail skin texture, cinematic realism, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.